You want to talk about why this Great Schism happened and just kind of get into that? I'm going to pronounce this guy's name wrong. I always do, but he was a Russian philosopher,
Soloviev, yeah.
So how do you say
Soloviev.
it? Soloviev. Yeah. And he wrote an article on the Great Schism, and maybe you don't even call it a schism, but I don't know. But can we call it a schism? Okay. So, but he made an interesting point, and he said that the greatest problem or the greatest tragedy in human history was not the Protestant Reformation. It was the Great Schism, because the church, the left and the right, the East and the West were separated. And the West, its structure and rigidity and legalism and order kept the East's more contemplative and mystical and speculative theology in check. And likewise, the East's beauty and artistic and dynamic theology kept the West's overly critical and judgmental and rigid and legalistic view in check. And so they were keeping each other in check. And so when this happened, I mean, the church split in half. Yeah. And it's not just the numbers that split in half. It was these very important counterbalances where both might be missing something now. I found that very compelling. I found that a very compelling argument. But tell us why it happened. And this is where the filioque comes in, and we can talk about that, because that's kind of cool to me. It's a little heady, but it's fun. But why did this happen?
So the churches were progressing historically separate from each other, and there wasn't a lot of communication. And so you had some more intentional differences. I don't know when it was, but I always have to laugh about, there was a time when, I don't know if it was just local bishops or even the Pope, outlawed beards among the clergy. You know, you cannot have a beard, you need to be clean shaven. And one of the reasons I heard for that, I need to look it up more, was that they wanted to not look like the Orthodox. You know, that basically there was it's almost like, the Council of Trent, where you have, let's unify the rites of the Catholic Church so that people aren't confused by going to a Lutheran church or an Anglican church or a Catholic church. They look different. You can easily identify who we're in union with and who we're not in union with. So there was always this, even Charlemagne did a lot of this himself. Let's make sure that we are known to belong to this empire, this kingdom, this church, as opposed to somebody else. And so I don't think there was a lot of appreciation for what you just said. I mean, when you look at the early heresies and the early schisms, if you will, you had, and this is something I've been thinking a lot about the past couple of years, you have Jesus Christ as God and man. And the earliest heresies,
we're all about that.
Right. We're separating those two. So he's God and man. That's a paradox. So we accept that on a matter of faith as a revelation from God, and we contemplate this beautiful reality. But there's a tension there. I'm uncomfortable with saying, how can he be with God and man? That makes no sense. But orthodoxy, true belief, true glory, holds those things in tension. As soon as you sever that tension, then you get Antioch and Alexandria fighting over, no, he was God but looked like a man, or he was a man but kind of got the grace to be God. And you say, I can't live in that tension. Same thing with Mary, Virgin and Mother. As soon as we alleviate that tension, so it's a much less of an explicit paradox. But when you have, as you mentioned, you have the kind of the heady, what became scholasticism and what could be called legalistic and very structured West, and then the more mystical, free-flowing East. There's a good tension there that reveals Christ, and in all the tensions of all the paradoxes within Christianity, but those were severed. And so you have both churches, I believe, and you could see this historically, even though I think both churches remained authentic ways, became authentic ways to find Christ and to live within the kingdom. That's true. And you can live within one or the other. Again, with one of the many churches, many rites, you can live completely within one of those and find holiness and find Christian perfection and find heaven. But they're both very fragile without the other one saying, let me ask you about this, because this seems contrary to the way we do things, or this seems almost contradictory to the way we do things. And these debates should be happening even in authentic lived realities that you can live within each church and truly be holy, truly get to heaven.
Yeah. So what was the main debate that caused this ruckus? What, 1054? Is that the right year? So was it the filioque? And am I saying it right? Filioque. Filioque.
Yeah.
By the way, for those in Latin, you put que at the end of a word sometimes to be a precedent to say and, right?
Yeah.
So philia is son, filioque.
I'm probably not pronouncing it correctly either.
Right.
That's just how most people say it.
So, but it means and the son. That's what the word means, right? And that comes from our creed, which everyone's used to hearing. I'm just saying it so people know what we're talking about. Yeah. The Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. Yes. That's where this debate comes from. Was that the straw that broke the camel's back?
I think that within the other things like leaven, unleavened bread, when are you giving infants the Eucharist, the married priesthood? I mean, these were all and have continued to be issues. But that one, because the creed is such a sacred part and a liturgical part of the church, that became an issue because what happened is
we changed it.
Yeah.
Didn't the West change it?
The West changed it. So the original creed in Greek did not have, it just said Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father. But there was a heresy only in the West, I believe in Spain. It was basically a leftover from Arianism. And so the way that the bishops in the West fought this new form, it kind of evolved form of Arianism, was to say, let's emphasize the divinity of the Son by reflecting upon an Augustinian theology that the Spirit proceeds from the Father, or the Spirit's kind of the love between the Father and the Son, this idea. So when you have that, you say, okay, so the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, but the term was filioque. Again, Augustine spoke Latin, not Greek. But when they insert it into the creed, they already were using a Latin creed, and that's why I can say filioque, because that's a Latin term, as you just explained. So the Greek churches, and if you go, I've never seen this, but if you go to Greece now, the Roman Catholic churches in Greece do not say filioque. They use the original Greek creed. So there are Roman Catholic churches that never added that phrase into their creed.
Do you know when the West added it?
It started, I'm guessing, in the 7th, 8th century in certain dioceses, but it wasn't until the 11th century, I believe, when it became a universal. So it was 1,000 years after Christ, after 700 years after the creed, that it was added in the West.
Athanasius had a creed. I think it's called the Athanasian Creed, and I think the old Latin. I should look up and see what that says in there. But so when you have like God from God, light from light, true God from true God, all of these statements are the church's attempt to counteract heretical things, yes. Right? And so
it was we call it the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed because it was those councils. Creed's not in the Bible, of course. So those councils were addressing very specific heresies and tensions in the church, and the creed was an answer to that.
Right. So the West adds and the Son into the creed. It spreads probably slowly, and the East got what? They got upset about it and said, they said, why are you changing the creed? So was the debate over you're changing the creed or over the theological point of procession from the Father and the Son?
A little bit of both, but the changing of the creed, in my understanding, is when it became emotional. Like you can't change the creed. The creed is one thing that we hold in common. So nowadays, I mean, I truly believe that you have fathers, East and West, that have tried to explain what we mean by the procession. And again, it's a semantic difference. The word in Greek and the word in Latin mean two different things. And so when you have translation issues, they mean two different things. So you can see why the churches using these intricacies of language kind of went two different directions. When Jerome translated the scriptures, Romans 5:12, this is where the debate about original sin came in, because in Greek there was some freedom and in Latin there wasn't. So Jerome had to choose one way to kind of reduce that freedom for the sake of the language. So you have these two different theologies going off. Now, I think this keeps us humble. Honestly, I really do. There's the fact that we're using translations in each church and you're able to say it's got to be bigger than this, because when we talk about the filioque, the procession of the Spirit, we're talking about the eternal procession. That's the debate. People will use the scriptures and say, well, didn't Jesus say, I'm going to go to heaven and send the Spirit? So isn't that him sending the Spirit? So doesn't the Spirit come from the Father and the Son? And we say, yes, in time. But the filioque basically in the creed is talking about the eternal procession of the Spirit, which is different than the Spirit in time. And so Catholics will say very beautifully and eloquently, how do we know about the eternal procession of the Spirit, except that the procession of the Spirit in time, the sending at Pentecost, can't you say the way it happened in time, that's all has really been revealed, so can't we say the same thing happened in eternity? And Augustine's view again of the Spirit being kind of the love between the Father and the Son, but both churches have an issue with the way the other sees it and says that's going to cause actual real world problems. So the Orthodox will say the fact that the filioque is in the creed, and even the theology about that, has created a hierarchy, because if you have the Spirit proceeding from the Father and the Son, then doesn't that imply a hierarchy where you have the Father is the greatest, and then the Son is second because the Spirit comes from the Father and the Son. The Son doesn't come from the Father and the Spirit, although he did in time, of course. And so you have this hierarchy, and many Orthodox will say, well, that has created a hierarchy that is overly hierarchical in the West, and that's why there's such an overemphasis of the administrative authority of the Pope, of the Holy Father. And they'll say it's reflected in the creed, it's reflected in the theology. So this is, over time, it became further than just a creed issue. It became a lived reality within the churches. But I may be just pandering here, but to me, the reality is so far beyond what our language and what our theology can say. We're talking about the inner life of the Trinity here.
Yeah.
Something revealed. How dare either church say, this is how the inner life of the Trinity works, and your 1,000-year-old theology that's different than ours is just wrong. It's a very odd thing to I like the debate within union. Within union, why not debate those things? If God is there, but to let that be an issue of schism. But I'll tell you, before I forget, that right now, in 2025, the real issue is the role of the Pope. That is really the only issue that people that really desire union would say. Does the Pope of Rome have administrative authority over every Christian in the world, which is basically what Vatican I says? And that's the big debate over, is the role of the Holy Father administratively over all the churches. There's other debates, of course, but that's the big one.
What do you say to that?
I'm a Catholic, and so I listen to and I'm obedient to Vatican I. But I can tell you that I personally think that, just like, say, the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, when you read the dogma, it seems to imply that the dogma was written out of a Roman Catholic understanding of original sin. And again, we
got to get into that.
Sure. So
you've said it twice now.
Okay, yeah.
And well, keep going, but
sure,
we can come back to original sin because it's fascinating.
Okay. I'll let you remember that because I won't.
Yeah, I will.
Okay, but so I think that there's a way, if you can say Vatican I there was basically no involvement of the Eastern churches at all. And so it's understandable that the assumption when having a council, the assumption is going to be Roman Catholic theology, Roman Catholic spirituality, Roman Catholic administration. And there was, as many would say, Vatican I was basically the conclusion of Trent. And so Trent was obviously kind of Reformation. It was a reaction to the Protestant Reformation. So if Vatican I is kind of putting a stamp on so that we don't have issues with the schismatics, with the Protestants especially, who are now outside of the church, we need to kind of circle the wagons. We need to understand what is the true church and what is not. And so Vatican I was very, very explicit. So therefore, the Holy Father must have authority over every Christian, and always has, of course, the council said, over every single Christian. I believe I believe, because but the foundation of my understanding is that God desires the union of the churches, real union of the churches, and the fact that the Eastern Christian churches are as valid and their theology and spirituality is as a recipient of the revelation as the West is. So when you, that's my assumption. I really believe that's true. So if that's true, then you're going to say, let's take Vatican I and let's assess it and see if there's a way of saying the council was speaking of appointing bishops and things like that from a Roman Catholic perspective that was coming out of a reaction to the Protestants, etc., and Trent. How do we say that the more synodal way of choosing bishops or having authority in the East, how do we say, how can that inform our understanding and authentic interpretation of the authority of the Pope? I do see practically that it makes sense to have one man who is the vicar of Christ that has the final word. I just think that the way that that's going to work for the Eastern Christians is there you throw in enough bureaucracy, so it rarely ever needs to get to Rome. You can have structures of appointing bishops and guiding councils and synods. You can have those within the authentic churches, and if there's issues, you go to Rome. But Rome doesn't need to oversee all of these things. Rome needs to be informed. The Pope does need to be informed about these things, but he doesn't need the direct administrative authority that you see even over us. We don't choose our own bishops in the Ruthenian Church. We do the same thing the Roman Catholics do. We submit 3 names, it goes to Rome. That's just, it's very odd according to our, I believe, authentic understanding of even the administration and the functioning, the ecclesiastical running of a church.
Hey, thanks guys for checking out the Conor Gallagher Show. Please take a moment to like, subscribe, or comment, or whatever you got to do to support it. And I appreciate that very much.